Texas, 1881. The late autumn sun baked the dust into the wooden bones of the market town, turning the air thick and restless. Horses neighed, cattle bawled, and men barked over prices with whiskey breath and worn boots. The last livestock auction of the season was drawing to a close, but a restless crowd still lingered near the corral gate, drawn by something quieter and far more unsettling than the sale of animals. A bay mare stood trembling inside the pen, ribs sharp beneath her hide, her flanks marked with dried blood. Yet it was not the horse that held their attention. Silas Carrigan adjusted his hat against the glare, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow across the packed clay. At 35, he was a man shaped by land and silence, known more to his cattle than to any living soul, and he rarely came to town unless he needed supplies or horses. That morning, he had spotted the mare and circled back as the bidding thinned. His boot heels thudded softly against the hard ground as he approached the pen, his gaze steady and unreadable. That was when he noticed her. A girl no more than 19 stood just behind the corral, her dark hair matted to her face, her dress torn at the hem. Dust clung to her bare feet. She did not speak, did not cry, and her eyes wandered as if following something no one else could see. Beside her stood a man with a bottle in one hand and a rope in the other. The rope was tied not to an animal, but to her wrist. "Got a dumb one here," the drunk hollered, swaying as he raised the bottle. "Came from my first wife, I think. Don't talk, don't hear, neither. But she cleans, cooks, and don't sass." "A cheap!" A few men chuckled darkly. One spat into the dust. Silas turned away. He had not come for this. He wanted the horse and nothing more. But then he felt it. Not a voice, not a cry. Just a glance. He looked back. The girl was watching him. There was no desperation in her face, no pleading in her posture. Only a clear, steady gaze fixed upon him. In that look was something he had not seen in years. Understanding, or perhaps a mirror of his own loneliness. The drunk stumbled closer, thrusting the rope forward. "You got coin," he slurred. "Want the horse? She comes with it. I ain't dragging her back. Not worth the dust on her toes." Silas hesitated. The mare pawed at the ground, blowing froth through her nostrils. The girl's gaze never wavered. Slowly, he turned back to the drunk and met his bleary eyes. "I'll take both." Laughter burst from the nearby men, crude and mocking. "You buying livestock or starting a harem, Silas?" one called out. Silas did not answer. He counted coins into the man's hand. Enough for a horse, not enough for a soul. The drunk yanked the rope toward him, but the girl flinched and stepped instinctively behind Silas. "She's yours now," the man slurred. "Don't say I didn't warn you. Ain't worth feeding." Silas untied the rope and tossed it back. He guided the mare out of the pen, the girl following behind with soft, deliberate steps. She carried nothing but a thin shawl draped over her shoulders. When they reached his wagon, she stopped and waited in silence. He opened the back and motioned for her to climb in. She obeyed, folding herself into the corner like someone used to being invisible. As Silas climbed onto the driver's bench, he felt the faintest tug on his coat. He looked down. Her fingers, small and calloused, brushed his sleeve just once. She did not meet his eyes now. Her gaze rested on the distant hills. Yet in that single touch, he felt something stir. She had not thanked him, had not begged, but in that moment, she had chosen to trust him. Silas Carrigan, a man who spoke more with horses than with men, lived alone on 200 acres of red Texas clay, with fences for company and scars he never named. And now, behind him, sat a girl who could not hear, a girl who might understand more than anyone he had ever known. He snapped the reins. The wagon creaked forward, wheels crunching over the hard road out of town. Behind him, the girl sat curled beneath a blanket, her face turned toward the wind. She never looked back. Neither did he. The wagon rolled through dusk and dust, winding between low hills and scattered mesquite until the fields widened and the sky opened into Texas emptiness. Silas's ranch was modest, a main house with a slanted roof, a few weathered outbuildings, and a long stretch of prairie where cattle grazed under open sky. It was quiet, clean, and for a man like him, it had always been enough. Until now. He helped the girl down from the wagon, unsure whether she would bolt or freeze. Instead, she stepped lightly to the ground. Her eyes swept across the land, not frightened, only watchful, as if cataloging everything without asking permission. Inside the kitchen, Silas stoked the fire and pointed toward the kettle. She nodded and moved without hesitation, finding the tin cups and ladle as if she had always belonged near warmth and hunger. Still, she made no sound. After supper, he handed her a piece of chalk and tapped the wooden doorframe beside the table. "Name," he said slowly. She studied him for a long moment before crouching beside the frame. With careful fingers, she wrote a single word in soft, slanted letters. "Emeline." Silas read it once, then again. "Emeline," he repeated aloud, testing the sound as it settled into the quiet. She offered no smile, only turned and slipped into the darkened barn. The next morning, he found her crouched beside the wounded mare. The horse had barely eaten since the auction, its back leg swollen from strain. Emeline ran a damp cloth down the mare's flank, her movements gentle and patient, as if whispering with her hands. Silas stood at the barn door, arms crossed. He had seen seasoned ranch hands get kicked for less, but the mare remained still, shuddering only slightly, as Emeline wrapped its leg with quiet care. Maybe she could not hear, but she understood. That day, Silas gave her simple chores. She washed the floorboards, boiled water, and cleaned the tack room without complaint or sound. Each night he left chalk by the table, and she wrote notes in careful script along the doorframe. Bacon low, dog limping, wind smells like dust. They never spoke, yet the silence between them did not feel empty. Until the storm came. It began like most Texas storms, slow and deceitful. A hot breeze rose near sundown, brushing through the tall grass like a warning breath. Silas noticed a line of dark clouds brewing far off, but thought little of it. He was in the cattle shed when she appeared, barefoot and breathless, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. Emeline grabbed his sleeve and tugged hard. "What?" he asked, startled. She pointed upward, her hands trembling, her eyes wide with urgency. He hesitated, but something in her gaze snapped him into motion. She pulled again, urging him away from the corral. Then it happened. A blinding flash split the sky. Lightning struck the tall oak behind the cattle shed, exploding in a thunderous crack that shook the earth. Sparks flew as the tree burst into flame and collapsed with a groan that sounded like the sky itself weeping. Silas stumbled back as the calves bawled in terror. Smoke curled into the darkening sky. He turned slowly toward her. Emeline stood just outside the doorway, her face lit by flickering firelight, and her eyes steady and certain. She had known, not guessed, not sensed after the wind changed. She had known before the thunder ever came. Silas walked toward her, still half in shock. "How did you—" But she only looked at him, silent and sure. and for the first time in years, Silas Carrigan felt something stir deep within his chest, a quiet, unsettling realization that he was no longer alone, and that the girl the world had called deaf might be listening to something far deeper than sound. Since the night of the storm, Silas Carrigan found himself watching Emeline more closely, not with suspicion, but with the quiet curiosity of a man who had lived too long in silence and now faced something he could not explain. She never spoke. She rarely wrote more than her name. Yet there were moments when it seemed she understood the world more clearly than anyone he had ever known. One cold morning, Silas noticed his best cow standing apart from the herd, refusing to eat. He chalked it up to the weather and made a note to watch her. But Emeline moved without hesitation. She carried fresh straw to the birthing stall, drew water scented with mint leaves, and stood beside the cow, her hands resting gently on its swollen belly. By sunset, the animal went into labor. Silas said nothing, but he watched her with new respect. Somehow, she had known. Days passed in quiet rhythm. Emeline brewed coffee before dawn, swept the porch, and brushed the horses in slow, patient circles. Each night, she left small notes in chalk along the doorframe. Dog limping, fence loose, wind smells like rain. But their silence no longer felt empty. It felt understood. One afternoon, Silas returned from town with a heaviness he could not shake. The sheriff had spoken in guarded tones about his land, whispering of old claims and bloodshed tied to his father's past. Shame settled on him like dust, thick and suffocating. He said nothing of it, but as he sat on the front step, staring into the fading light, Emeline appeared beside him. She did not speak. She simply placed her hand gently on his shoulder. Silas muttered, "How did you know I feel shame about this land, about what my father did to keep it?" Emeline's dark eyes searched his face. Slowly, she lifted her hand and pressed it over his heart. Then she turned and walked toward the old oak tree where his father's grave rested beneath the Texas sky. She had never read the stone and never asked a question, yet she knew. That night, Silas woke from a restless dream, his father's voice echoing through smoke and memory. He sat upright, breath ragged, and saw her seated quietly by the hearth. A single candle flickered beside her, casting soft light across her face. On the table lay a faded blue handkerchief, trimmed with lace, his mother's. It had been locked away for years in a cedar chest. No one else knew it existed. "How?" he whispered. Emeline did not answer. She rose and slipped quietly from the room. She did not need to explain. She heard what no one else could: pain, grief, and the silent weight of memories too heavy for words. And in her quiet presence, she answered him. From that night forward, Silas feared nothing for his land, nor his legacy, nor even his soul, and he feared only losing the one person who understood him without ever hearing a word. But the world beyond his fences was not as kind. The first whisper came from the blacksmith's wife. "She stares too long at the cattle," she said one afternoon, her voice sharp as wire, "like she knows which one will fall next." By week's end, the preacher's son added to the rumors. "She touched our goat," he said. 2 days later, it gave birth too early. That ain't natural. No one had ever heard Emeline speak, and the fewer words she offered, the more the town filled her silence with fear. At the general store, a woman pulled her child away when Emeline came for flour. At the post office, someone spat near her feet. Most days, she kept her head lowered and walked quietly past the whispers, never flinching. Yet Silas noticed the way her fingers tightened around her basket and how her footsteps grew softer, as if she wished to disappear from ground, that refused to accept her. One afternoon, a ranch hand's boy fell ill with a burning fever, his small body trembling in sleep. The doctor was days away, and panic spread through the ranch. It was not the doctor who came. It was Emeline. She moved quietly into the barn where the child lay. Without asking permission, she knelt beside the cot and placed her hand on his chest, then his forehead. Her eyes closed, as if listening to something no one else could hear. Moments later, she stepped outside and gathered herbs from Silas's drying wall: lavender, feverfew, and rabbit tobacco. She returned with a steaming cloth and a gentle certainty. The boy drank the bitter brew, and by sunrise he sat upright, hungry and smiling. His mother wept with gratitude, clasping Emeline's hands in trembling thanks. Yet the next morning, the same woman whispered at the well. She never asked about his symptoms. How did she know? How did she know? The fear was no longer quiet. 3 days later, they came with torches, unlit, but carried like promises. 8 men and women stood at the gate of Silas's ranch, boots kicking up dust. At their head was Mr. Withers, a stern man whose own daughter had long ago turned her back on him. "We want her gone," he said coldly. "That girl hears things she ought not." Silas stood in the barn doorway, arms folded across his chest. He had not shaved in days, and his face was hard as weathered timber. "She's mute," he said calmly. "That ain't the same as deaf," Withers snapped. "Sometimes she sees what's coming before the sky even shifts. She talks to animals like they talk back. My steer dropped dead last week after she touched it. You think she cursed it? I think she's cursed, period." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Inside the house, Emeline stood behind the curtain, her hands still. She had heard the gravel shift beneath their boots. She had seen their faces twisted not with hatred, but with something worse: certainty. She reached for the door, but Silas raised a hand. He stepped forward, boots sinking into the thawing mud, and faced them squarely. "She saved a child's life. Maybe she's the one who gave him the fever," a woman spat. Silas did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "She is the only person I know who listens," he said quietly. "Not with ears, but with her hands, her breath, and her whole damn soul. I have lived 35 years, and I can count on one hand the number of people who truly heard me. Not just my words, but my silences, my regrets, my grief." And she did, without saying a single thing. The crowd stilled. "You want to run someone off for being different? For seeing the world you're too afraid to face? Fine, but you'll have to go through me." Withers opened his mouth, then closed it. No one moved. Slowly, the torches lowered. One by one, the townsfolk turned away, their boots heavy with doubt. That night, the ranch lay quiet beneath the whisper of the wind. Inside, Emeline placed a pot of warm cider on the fire and moved beside Silas at the table. She did not write, she did not sign. She simply reached out and rested her fingers on his hand. It was not thanks. It was recognition. As Silas turned his palm upward and gently curled his fingers around hers. Together, they sat in the stillness, listening to the crackle of the fire and the hush of the Texas night, as a bond deepened between two souls who had never needed words to understand each other. The first snowfall of December came quietly, drifting down like a soft blanket over all that had burned and broken. Emeline stood by the window of the log kitchen, her slender fingers threading a needle through scraps of wool and leather. She worked with patient care, stitching together pieces from an old coat Silas no longer wore. She was making a cloak for him. She did not need to hear the wind to know the cold was coming. Silas watched her from the barn doorway, leaning against the timber frame. She moved with quiet purpose, every motion deliberate. Since the townsfolk had turned away, and he had chosen to keep her beside him, his world had found a steady rhythm again. She brewed coffee each morning before the sky turned gray, lined the chicken coop with pine needles, and brushed the horses in slow, calming circles. She trained the yearlings with gestures no cowboy had ever thought to try. Animals listened to her as if she spoke their language. The silence around the ranch no longer felt like loneliness. It felt like listening. One late afternoon, Silas rode toward the ridge to check the fences before an approaching storm. The light was fading when his horse startled and reared, throwing him hard onto the frozen ground. Pain exploded through his shoulder and ribs. He staggered to his feet, blood seeping from a gash on his elbow. The sky darkened quickly, and each step toward the ranch sent sharp waves of pain through his body. When he stumbled into the yard at dusk, Emeline burst from the cabin before he could knock. She had felt it, or perhaps she had simply known. With gentle hands, she guided him inside and seated him beside the hearth. She cleaned the wound with warm water and pressed a poultice of yarrow and pine sap against it. Silas watched her quietly. "You always know," he whispered. She met his gaze. Then, without hesitation, she lifted his hand and pressed her lips softly against the edge of the wound. Silas stilled as the fire crackled, the room holding its breath. She did not speak, but something passed between them like a door opening in the silence. Later that night, as snow dusted the windows, Silas sat across from her at the table, and he took a piece of paper and wrote slowly, each letter shaped with care. He turned it toward her. "I want to hear your heart, if you'll let me listen with mine." Emeline studied the words for a long moment. Her fingers traced each letter, as if feeling the truth within them. When she finally raised her eyes, they shimmered with quiet warmth. She reached across the table and touched his chest, just once. Then, for the first time since she had entered his life, she smiled. Not a polite smile, not one of gratitude or fear, but a smile like sunrise breaking through a long winter. Outside, the wind howled, but inside the cabin, a silence deeper than words found its voice, warm and real. Winter softened, and life returned slowly between storms. So did something else, something quiet and steady between Silas and Emeline. She began to teach him sign language, her fingers moving like branches in the wind. Water. Fire. Thank you. Though he fumbled, she never laughed. Instead, she guided his hands with gentle patience until he understood. In turn, he taught her to ride. The first time she sat in the saddle, her knuckles turned white, but he walked beside her, speaking softly, though she could not hear. She felt the rhythm of the horse through her bones, and soon rode with grace beneath the wide Texas sky. They built a small room beside the cabin, part shelter and part refuge. There, they shared meals and long evenings by the fire. Their glances spoke more than language ever could. She smiled when birds gathered at dusk and flinched at sudden pops from the hearth. She always knew when a storm was coming. One night, Silas spelled a sentence in careful signs. "You make this place full." Emeline stared at him, then gently touched her fingers to his lips. It was not a kiss, but a thank you. A silent way of saying, "I hear you, too." Then came the storm that changed everything. Silas had fallen asleep by the fire after repairing fences all day. The sky had been calm, without warning. He woke to Emeline's hand on his shoulder. She pulled his coat toward him and pointed urgently toward the barn. Outside, the wind had shifted. Clouds raced across the moon, and the air crackled with electricity. In the barn, the horses thrashed in panic. Emeline moved among them with quiet certainty, touching each flank, calming them with nothing but her presence. A loud creak sounded overhead. Silas looked up just as a beam cracked. "We need to move them," he shouted. But she was already leading the mare outside, her hand signing quickly. "Roof will fall now." Together, they guided the horses to the shelter near the house. Rain struck the roof like fists, and thunder roared across the plains. Just as the last animal cleared the doorway, the barn's north beam collapsed, crashing to the ground where they had stood moments before. Silas turned to her, breathless. Emeline stood in the rain, her hair soaked, her eyes steady. "How did you know?" he asked. She touched her chest, then pointed toward the sky. He understood. Later, inside the cabin, he handed her a blanket and sat beside her. Taking her hand, he spelled, "You belong to this land." She smiled and placed his hand over her heart. For the first time, he felt its rhythm, quiet, steady, unafraid. She did not hear as others did. She heard deeper, and Silas knew then that he had finally been heard too. In the months that followed, something changed beyond the ranch. It began quietly, as most true change does. A ranch hand named Tom Weaver arrived with a torn shoulder. The doctor was miles away. Emeline examined the wound, her hand steady and sure, and bound it with herbs. 2 days later, he returned healed and grateful. Soon after, a widow came seeking rest from sleepless nights. Emeline sat beside her in silence until peace returned. The woman left behind a pie and a hand-stitched scarf. Word spread, not with fear this time, but with respect. Townsfolk began tipping their hats when they passed the ranch. Some left preserves by the gate. Each morning, Emeline wrote a single line of chalk on the slate beside the kitchen door. "Today will be good. I can feel it." Most days, she was right. Then came the Sunday that changed everything. A 7-year-old boy vanished during morning chores. Panic swept through the town. When Silas and Emeline heard, she knelt and pressed her palms to the earth, tracing faint marks invisible to others. Without hesitation, she began walking. Silas followed, then Tom, and then the rest of the townsfolk. They climbed ridges, crossed dry creek beds, and pushed through cedar groves until they reached a clearing. There, beneath a bent tree, lay the boy, frightened, injured, but alive. Emeline ran to him, brushing dirt from his face with gentle hands. When she looked up at Silas, there was no pride in her eyes, only relief. From that day forward, no one called her strange. They called her what she truly was, the girl who heard with her heart. Years passed, which the ranch stood weathered and wise beneath the endless Texas sky. Silas walked a little slower, and silver threaded Emeline's dark hair. But they counted time, not in years, but in seasons and quiet moments shared between two hands. Children from the town came to learn from her. She taught them to listen, not with ears, but with their whole being. Silas built a bench beneath the cottonwood tree where they sat each evening, watching the sun sink into the hills. Sometimes he played a tune on his harmonica, and Emeline closed her eyes, feeling the music ripple through the dusk. Then one evening, as the sky glowed amber and lilac, she turned to him. Over the years, she had learned to shape a few careful words, reading his lips and speaking softly. "I do not need sound," she whispered. "Only you." Silas blinked, his throat tight. After a long moment, he nodded gently. "I hear you," he said. "Always have." They sat together until the last light faded from the sky. The next morning, Emeline wrote her daily message on the chalkboard beside the front door. "Today will be kind. I feel it." No one questioned her anymore. They simply believed. And when the people of the town spoke of the girl who once could not speak or hear, they did not whisper the word witch. They called her the one who listens with her heart. Out on the quiet plains of the American West, where wind and silence speak the same language, a lonely rancher and a girl the world called deaf discovered a bond deeper than sound. A language of hands, of glances, of hearts that knew how to listen. And in that silence, they found love.